hi again. Let's conclude our discussion of the Phaedrus. This is the third video that I will offer some commentary on Plato's text for. And so we've talked about the connection between love and rhetoric, their capacity to enchant the person, to transform the person, to lead the person to excess rather than goodness. We've talked about how Socrates is committed not only to restraint in terms of love, but also to restraint in terms of rhetoric, and resist the power to manipulate through rhetoric, and instead to pursue truth. And so we began with a speech by Lysias that Phaedrus read, that argued that the non-lover is superior to the lover. Then Socrates was enchanted and going a little bit down this road towards excess because he was enchanted by Phaedrus. He offers a second speech where he gives the same argument that the non-lover is superior to the love. And then, as we discussed a moment ago, right, eventually he kind of snaps out of it and says, you know what, both of these were really bad. I made an error because I was in the process of being transformed by these two forces. Let me take back my speeches by giving another that speaks the truth, and thereby to atone and to accomplish a metanoia that brings me back to who I was. And the speech that he offers is one that argues that the lover, in fact, is superior to the non-lover, which seems to conform with logic anyway. So, interestingly, when they finish the speech, we finally get to a lengthier discussion of rhetoric without the metaphor of love to guide our understanding of it. So I want to look at some of these spaces towards the end of the text where rhetoric is explicitly the subject of a discussion. And on 156 in the rhetorical tradition, Socrates says, we should talk then, as we were proposing just now, of the theory of good or bad speaking or writing. Phaedrus says clearly, Socrates says, if a speech is to be good, doesn't the mind of the speaker know the truth about the matters about which he speaks? Talking about episteme, right? In other words, is knowledge of the real or the true just as important as knowing the general principles of how persuasion works? Phaedrus answers, on that point, Socrates, I have heard that one who is to be in order does not need to know what is really just, but what would just seem to the multitude, or what would seem just to the multitude who are to pass judgment, and not what is really good or noble, but will seem to be so. For they say that persuasion comes from what seems to be true, not the truth. Okay, so what Phaedrus is saying, he's saying a couple things. On the one hand, that persuasion just depends on the attitudes prevalent in the polis and the demos. In other words, in the society at large and in the people that inhabit it, right? And so, again, we see here that Phaedrus has in mind the manipulative rhetoric that says, hey, we don't need to know the truth. All we need to do is know what people think is true and play off of their beliefs to accomplish persuasion. And so, knowledge of the true is much less important than knowledge of pistis and doxa, belief or public opinion. And of course, Plato rejects strongly this idea of rhetoric. And he goes on a little further down. He says, then when the orator who does not know what is good and evil, right, the bad orator, the sophist, does not know what good and evil are, tries to persuade a state which is equally ignorant, not by praising the shadow of an ass under the name of a horse, but by praising evil under the name of the good, and having studied the opinions of the multitude, the rhetor or the orator persuades them to do evil instead of good. What harvest do you suppose his oratory will reap thereafter from that seed he's sown? And Phaedrus is not a very good harvest. So again, if we spend time with a rhetoric that seeks to understand only doxa as a means to entrance the demos, and so thereby to lead them to excesses, political excess, moral excess, these kinds of things, well, then we're going to be in a really bad position. And so Socrates claims, he says, well, do you think that we have reproached the art of speaking too harshly? That is rhetoric. Perhaps, she might say, why do you talk such nonsense, you strange men? I don't compel anyone to learn to speak without knowing the truth. But if my advice is of any value, he learns that first, the truth, and then acquires rhetorical expertise. So what I claim is this, that without my help, the knowledge of the truth does not give the art of persuasion. So he's saying someone else might argue that nobody says that you can't have the truth and use rhetoric, that the purpose of rhetoric is to disseminate truth. And Phaedrus says, well, if somebody did say that, would they be right? Socrates says, yes, if the arguments are coming against her testify that she is an art. So here the question is whether or not rhetoric is an art. That is it a techne, or is it just kind of some habit, or a hexis, a knack, right? He says, for I seem, as it were, to hear some arguments approaching and protesting that she is lying and is not an art, but is a craft devoid of art. A real art of speaking, says the Laconian, which does not seize hold of the truth, does not exist and never will. In other words, Socrates reiterates his criticism that he voiced very polemically in the Gorgias, that all rhetoric is a knack. It doesn't require any kind of technical ability, and it's wholly wrapped up in doxa and can't, in fact, consider the truth and what the truth might be. And so he continues, he says, is not rhetoric in its entire nature an art which leads the soul by means of words, not only in law courts and the various other public assemblages, but in private companies as well? And is it not the same when concerned with small things as with great? And, properly speaking, no more to be esteemed in important things than in trifling matters? And so he sort of continues that it just mixes everything up, right? That people use it for whatever. So I'm jumping ahead here. Socrates asks Phaedrus, then he whose speaking is an art will make the same thing appear to the same persons at one time just, and at another, if he wishes, unjust. In other words, Socrates says, well, do you agree that sometimes they'll argue one thing and then they come back and argue the exact opposite thing when they're pursuing different purposes? And this is an easy tactic. People do this all the time. They argue in favor of one thing and then they change their minds. I'm thinking about right now Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on the wall, right? They were fine with the wall until Trump became president, and now they say that it's an immoral thing to do. In rhetoric, this is called dissoi logoi, and that's the ability to make equally compelling arguments for contradictory positions and purposes. So anyways, Phaedrus says, yes, certainly, people do that, argue one thing and then go back and argue the opposite. Socrates says, and in political speaking, he'll make the same thing seem to the state at one time good and another time to be bad. Phaedrus says, just so. And do we not know that the Eleatic Palamedes Zeno has such an art of speaking that the same things appear to his hearers to be alike and unlike, one and many, stationary and in motion? Phaedrus says, certainly. Then Socrates says, then the art of contention in political speech is not confined to courts and to political gatherings, not just forensic rhetoric and deliberative rhetoric, but apparently, if it is an art at all, it would be one and the same in all kinds of speaking. The art by which a man will be able to produce a resemblance between all things which can be produced, and to bring to light the resemblances produced in disguise by anyone else. And he continues and says that by his account, right, this is how rhetoric works, is that it deceives people by producing resemblances. It makes the good or the bad look like the good. And it makes the untrue look like the true. It makes the opinion look like knowledge or truth. And so for these reasons, it's inherently deceptive in his eyes. And this is why, in his view, there can never be a rhetoric that is concerned with episteme or truth. And so the rhetorician for him accomplishes this transformation in others through a deception based on resemblances, illusions, if you will. And let's see. On page 160, there's some other jabs at rhetoric where he seems to say, look, there's nothing to this field. And Phaedrus is like, yes, there is stuff to this field. And Socrates says, well, what? What are we forgetting? And Phaedrus says, well, all the stuff that's in the rhetorical handbooks written by people like Gorgias and things like this. And they have a laugh at that, right? That basically, well, they must be talking about something because they're writing books about it. But really, it's just emptiness that, again, is used for these manipulative purposes to drag the soul towards excess and away from the ideal. And he explicitly attacks sophists on 160, in 161. Let's read a little bit further on, right? He's talking about the sophists here. Socrates says, would they not, since they are wiser than we, censure us also and say, Phaedrus and Socrates, we ought not to be angry, but lenient if certain people are ignorant of dialectics. He's offering the dialectical vision of truth-seeking through dialogue as opposed to the monological or one-voice rhetoric of display and manipulation that the sophists offer. So he says, shouldn't we be lenient with people who don't know how to engage in dialectical conversation and who have been unable to define the nature of rhetoric and on this account have thought, when they possess the knowledge that is a necessary preliminary to rhetoric, that they had discovered rhetoric and believe that by teaching these preliminaries to others, they've taught them rhetoric completely, and that the persuasive use of these details in the composition of the whole discourse is a small matter which their pupils must supply of themselves in their writings or their speeches. Phaedrus says, well, Socrates, it does seem that which those men teach and write about as the art of rhetoric were such as you describe. I think you're right. But how and from whom is the truly rhetorical and persuasive art supposed to be acquired? Right? And this is hinting again at these occasional concessions that Plato seems to make, that there is such a thing as a good rhetoric. And Socrates says, whether one can acquire it so as to be a perfect orator, Phaedrus, is probably, and perhaps must be, dependent on conditions, like everything else. If you're naturally rhetorical, you will become a notable orator. When to your natural endowments, you have added knowledge and practice. At whatever point you are deficient in these, you will be incomplete. But so far as the art is concerned, I don't think the quest of it lies along the path of Lysias and Thrasymachus. Right? And so in other words, he's saying, look, maybe there is a true rhetoric, but this is going to be absolutely central to it if it's there, because only by this can we teach sort of self-restraint, love of the truth, and movement towards the good. And that, for Socrates, is the aim. Interestingly, this dialogue concludes with this Egyptian myth on the origin of writing as a tool to aid memory. That this god presents another god in Egypt with the invention of writing. So look at this. I made this thing that can help people to remember. And of course the other god says, well, no, actually this does the opposite of what you think it does. It makes people forgetful, right? Because they know that they can return to the text and be remembered of what they had forgotten. And so this is a critical view of writing as a technology, right? Writing as it relates to orality. And orality seems to be the favored mode of Socrates in this dialogue. Of course, this has implications for the five canons of rhetoric, for the role of memory in rhetorical praxis. It has consequences for things like invention, and certainly consequences for how this process of transformation works. And we will discuss more about that as our semester goes on. Have a good night. Homework for next time, read Aristotle's On Rhetoric, post a response, and do the rest of the stuff listed under next week on the syllabus. Thanks.